If you are new to our channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button.
Well, Holly, let's go to the Ivy Organics 3-in-1 Plant Guard Hotline and bring in our next guest.
Michelle Balz is a longtime backyard composter with a passion for reducing our impact on the planet. She spends her days writing laid-back advice for home composters in the Confessions of a Composter blog, teaching classes on backyard composting, learn everything she can about composting, recycling, reusing, and waste reduction. She has a new book out, Composting for a New Generation, Latest Techniques for the Bin and Beyond. Welcome to the program, Michelle.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're so glad you've taken time out of your day to teach all of us a little bit more about composting, because it's a very confusing topic when it comes to home gardeners that we have found.
Well, it shouldn't be. It's pretty simple once you get the hang of it. There's a few basic concepts, but after that, then it's smooth sailing.
I think a lot of people have misconceptions about composting. They've heard things, that might not be accurate, or they have friends or family members who are like, what are you doing in your backyard? So what is the biggest misconception about composting?
I would say the biggest misconception is that it's going to smell and that it's difficult to do. And as far as it being difficult to do, as once you get a few basic concepts down, it's actually super easy to do. It takes very little time out of your day. And then the smell, all you really have to do is make sure it's well balanced and that your material's covered, and you will have no smell.
So let's talk about that smell. There's anaerobic and aerobic compost piles. Which is the one that we should be having?
Very good question. So aerobic is what you should have. And what that means is that you work air into the pile. So when it goes anaerobic, that's when you get that kind of bad smell. It smells a little bit like a swamp. That means that there's not enough air in there, and then the bacteria that have grown into your pile are the anaerobic bacteria. So that it will decompose, but it decomposes much more slowly, and it also creates that smell. So if you're able to work air into your pile, then you're not going to get those anaerobic bacteria.
Okay, so what is the ideal recipe for a simple backyard compost? Something that maybe people just, they work full time, have other things going on. They don't want to, so they're thinking about size, and they're also thinking about what's the best stuff to add to it.
Yeah, so the basic size that you want is at least 3 foot by 3 foot. If you buy a plastic bin at the store, then you're set. They've already figured out what size you need. And as far as the balance, the recipe, you want to put for every 1 part of kitchen scraps or fresh material like fresh cut grass that you put in your pile, you want about 3 parts of dry, dead leaves or brown material, shredded newspaper if you don't have leaves. You need to balance that 1 part green to 3 parts brown, and that's really the best recipe.
Well, let's talk about having problems with the compost pile. What are some problems that people have? One, is it putting the wrong stuff in the pile, and 2, I would expect it being rodents or animals digging in that pile.
That's very true. So you want to make sure that you're only composting fruit and vegetable scraps. Don't want to put meat or cheese, dairy, any kind of dairy, because that is going to create an odor that will attract rodents and those kinds of animals. And it also will create that smell. It's just, meat decaying does not smell good. So you want to keep that out of your backyard. And then you also want to make sure that you are burying your food scraps every time you put it in. And that does a couple things. It helps balance, like I was talking about earlier, but then it also keeps any odors out so that the critters aren't attracted to your bin. And then it also keeps fruit flies out. So we bring fruit flies home on our vegetables from the supermarket, and then they will start growing. So if you bury those food scraps, they will not burrow down into the pile, so then you won't have the fruit flies problem.
But there are some flies that are good for the pile, isn't it? Aren't there?
Oh, absolutely. So the baby stage of the flies, otherwise known as maggots, there are some flies, black soldier flies in particular, where they're actually that's a great decomposer for your pile. And the black soldier flies are not the annoying kind of flies. They're going to fly around your head. They pretty much will leave you alone. So there are some flies that are okay, but mostly you're looking at other types of macroinvertebrates that are going to be eating your materials.
Well, we'll talk about vermicomposting in a moment, but I want to talk about people who don't have that ability to have that 3 foot by 3 foot square foot box in the backyard. There is a method called trench or pit composting. Explain those methods and the benefits that they might have versus a pile.
Yeah, so I have a whole chapter in the book about integrating composting into your garden, and those pit and trench composts are one of those ways to do it. And the concept is super simple. You just dig a hole deep enough that you're burying your food scraps. You bury your food scraps, you put some leaves in there, and then you cover it up. So that's what a pit composting is. And there are people that do that, especially if they have a garden bed that is really poor soil and they're not planning on planting anything there. They just want to work a little while on amending that soil. That's a good way to do that. The trench composting is very similar to a pit, but you're digging a trench, right? And one really good method of doing that is if you have garden rows, you can have your composting trench on one of the rows that you're not planting, because it does that as that material is decomposing, it does take nitrogen a little bit out of the soil around it. So you don't want to be planting right on top of that, but it is one way to amend your soil slowly, and it's a pretty easy way to compost, because once the material is decomposed, it's right there in your ground. You don't have to harvest it.
Okay. Now, sometimes people will hear the word vermicomposting or vermiposting and are not, quite familiar with what that is. What is something that, or could you explain that briefly, what that is?
Absolutely. So vermicomposting is composting with worms. It's composting with a very specific type of worm called red wigglers. And you have to buy those special. You can't just go into your backyard and grab some worms and put them in a bin. But you build this bin. The red wigglers, they are leaf litter worms that like to be in that kind of material. So the earthworms in your backyard like to dig down really deep into the soil. These guys don't. And they can eat half their body weight in food scraps a day. So if you have a pound of worms, you can put a half a pound of food scraps in that bin a day. And the material you get out of it, the vermicompost, is some of the highest quality material compost that you can make. And if you look up online, that's like buying some vermicastings or vermicompost, you'll see that it's actually quite valuable.
Now, with that vermicomposting, two things. One, I've been told you don't want to add citrus skins to that the unit for the worms, and two, that whatever device you have these worms in, they will stop multiplying once their box or bin is at capacity. They're not going to overpopulate themselves. Is it correct?
That's right. Yes. So with the citrus, for some reason, citrus does not work well in a vermicomposting. As you can imagine, it is acidic. So it's going to change the acidity since it's such a small bin that's a problem. But then also, whenever I've accidentally put a citrus peel into my vermicompost bin, I get these little tiny white flies that are attracted to that, and those are really annoying. So I completely avoid citrus in my vermicompost. And then, I'm sorry, I forget your other question.
They won't overpopulate themselves. They'll quit whenever the bin is full or their
That's
community
right,
is full.
yeah. So they self-regulate their population. So when they'll mate and lay eggs and repopulate your bin as you feed them. If you feed them less, then you'll have less worms in there. And then if they fill up, if your bin fills up with vermicompost that needs to be harvested, then there's not as much space for them to grow. So you won't ever have a problem of an overabundance of worms.
And that's great, because you can harvest those and create another bin, but you want to keep that soil moist, because worms want a certain amount of moisture. Otherwise, they're going to die or get too wet and drowned.
That's right. They basically breathe through their skin, so you have to keep a moist environment for them to be able to live.
So let's go back outside and talk about this compost pile that we've created. There is called cold composting, and there's called hot composting. Now, if you can, we've talked about both of those, but I want you to go into more of the science of it. And is there a benefit to one versus the other, or as long as this stuff breaks down, we're in good shape?
Yes, the age-old hot composting versus cold composting debate. Basically, the way I look at it is cold composting is kind of a lazy way of composting, which is perfectly fine. I mean that completely unjudgmentally. So with cold composting, you don't have to put as much work into it. You still want to have a good balance, but you don't have to turn it as often. You don't have to worry about cutting the materials down. There has been some studies that have shown you do get a nice, a different kind of nutrient profile in finished compost that comes from cold composting versus hot composting. The benefits of hot composting are that you get finished compost much more quickly. It does take more work, so you have to be out there turning the pile, making sure you're aerating it. You want to make sure that, the leaves you put in there are shredded, that any food scraps you put in there are pretty finely chopped up. You want to make sure you're testing the moisture level. You even get out there and turn it every other day sometimes, depending on what kind of method you're using. So hot composting definitely takes more work. You get finished compost faster. But then there are benefits of cold composting, right? I mean, we all live busy lives, and so sometimes it's nice to just relax and do things the easy way.
Excellent. Now, where can we find your book and find more about you?
So you can buy the book Composting for a New Generation at Lowe's, at pretty much any, on Amazon, pretty much any bookstore. I am on Instagram and Twitter as Compost Geek, if you want to follow me there and my silly stories. But yeah, you can find the book pretty much anywhere books are sold.
Well, Michelle, we greatly appreciate you taking time out of your day to enlighten us and inform us about composting and how we can do it better in our own communities. Well, thanks so much for having me on. Absolutely. Thank you for checking out the Wisconsin Vegetable Gardener radio show. For more, go to the WisconsinVegetableGardener.com for full-length in-studio video and podcast replay of Season 1. Season 2 underway and added weekly. Tweet us at TWVG Show or hashtag TWVG to be part of the program.